Let's examine the reliability of the Gospels, the chronicle of the life of Christ from 4 different authors. We do this because we do not have the original of these books, but that's the case with every work of antiquity. The first test is the bibliographical test. The first question to be answered is, how soon were the documents written after the events they recorded? Let's take a look at other documents of antiquity to see how this standard is applied. Dr. Paul Meier.
When we survey the authors from classical antiquity, the secular authors, we find a vast difference between when they wrote their works and the oldest manuscripts we have today. For example, Plato, the great philosopher, died in 347 BC, and yet the first manuscripts we have are from the 10th century AD, 1200 years later. Or let's take Herodotus, the father of history. He died in 425 BC, and yet the oldest manuscripts of any of his works date from the 10th century, some 1300 years later. There are only 8 copies of his work available for comparison. The writings of Julius Caesar and his great commentary on the Gallic Wars provide us with 10 manuscripts, only 10, dated some 1,000 years after his death. And finally, the oldest manuscript of any of Aristotle's works is dated 1,400 years after it was written. And there are only 49 copies of his work available for examination. And so we have a span of between 1,000 and 1,400 years between when these works were written and the earliest available copies we have today. And yet, most scholars consider them very reliable.
3 of the Gospels were written within a few decades of the life of Christ. The time between the original document and the earliest existing copies is less than any other work of antiquity. And the number of manuscripts available for comparison? Today, over 5,000, and that number continues to grow.
There's no question that we have today, paradoxically, the further away we're getting from the events of the first century and before, we're getting a more and more accurate text. And even with the other texts that may not be quite as accurate, there is nothing ever discovered in any of the other editions which violates any basic doctrine in the Christian faith.
There is no other group of ancient writings that even comes close to the bibliographical evidence for the trustworthiness of the New Testament.